Our gospel lesson is from Mark's Gospel, chapter 9, verses 38 through 50. This is on page 42 of the New Testament, if you'd like to read along. John said to Jesus, "Teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he was not following us." But Jesus said, "Do not stop him, for no one who does a deed of power in my name will be able soon afterward to speak evil of me. Whoever is not against us is for us. For truly I tell you, whoever gives you a cup of cold water to drink because you bear the name of Christ will by no means lose the reward. If any of you put a stumbling block before one of these little ones who believe in me, it would be better for you if a great millstone were hung around your neck and you were thrown into the sea. If your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life maimed than to have two hands and to go to hell, to the unquenchable fire. And if your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life lame than to have 2 feet and to be thrown into hell. And if your eye causes you to stumble, tear it out. It's better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be thrown into hell, where the worm never dies and the fire is never quenched. For everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good, but if salt has lost its saltiness, how can you season it? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. Almighty God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts, may our whole lives, words, thoughts, and deeds be acceptable in your sight, O God, who art our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Does it ever feel to you like we are constantly under pressure to choose sides? Whose side are you on? Does it ever feel like you just can't get away from that? And this pressure to choose sides? Maybe it's not that big a deal. Happens all the time. If you walk into a wedding ceremony, you're supposed to be asked by an usher, groom side or bride side? Whose side are you on? That's not something you're going to argue about, is it? That's not something you're going to fight about, is it? But I bet everybody can think of some circumstances where you weren't sure, where you were sitting at some wedding and a boyfriend or a girlfriend came in and sat down, and before you knew it, somebody was whispering, "I can't believe they're sitting on that side." Whose side are you on? Not that big a deal. Maybe you went to a football game this weekend. Did you sit on the home side or did you sit on the visitor's side? And what if someone had called you and said, "Hey, I've just gotten an extra ticket to the game. Would you like to come?" And you said, "Oh, I might be interested." And the friend said, "The only problem is, this ticket's over on the other side." And all of a sudden you start to make excuses. "Well, I think I have a dentist appointment I forgot about. It sounds good. I just can't make the game." And you get off the phone and you say to your spouse, "I can't believe they were going to expect me to go to that game and sit on the other side of the field with those people over there." Ever heard anybody say something like that? Whose side are you on? Sometimes it feels like we can't get away from the pressure of having to choose sides. Thinking about that pressure of choosing sides for whatever reason, I kept hearing the words of Abraham Lincoln this week from his second inaugural address, where he said, "Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or duration which it has already attained. Neither side anticipated that the cause of the conflict might cease with, or even before the conflict itself should cease. Each side looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. Both sides read the same Bible. Both sides pray to the same God, and each invokes God's aid against the other. It may seem strange that any person should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces, but let us judge not, that we be not judged. The prayers of both sides could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that person by whom the offense cometh." And how can we forget Lincoln's concluding words when we think about those sides? With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among yourselves and with all nations. Whose side are you on? Does it ever feel like we're under constant pressure to choose sides? What did Jesus say at the end of this passage from Mark? Be at peace among yourselves. Whose side are you on? We even began worship today. Did you hear that in the psalmist? Sometimes it seems like we can't get away from it. The psalmist said in 124, if it were not that the Lord was on our side. Can you imagine that being in the Bible? If it were not that the Lord was on our side. Scholars believe that this Psalm 124, which was part of our call to worship, is one of the psalms, the songs of ascent that the pilgrims would have sung as they made their way toward Jerusalem. They believe it's a liturgical psalm, a song that was used for worship. So in some sense, the people sang out. There was call and response. There was call and response. Whose side were you on? Whose side are you on? If it were not that the Lord was on our side. But it's interesting about the psalm and the way it's used. It isn't that any particular or specific enemy is named. Nobody in particular is vilified. Nobody in particular is denied. But the community does declare and confess this sense that as God's community, they're called not to be a community that finds themselves pulled apart by the sides that are created by humankind's division. But they're called to be the community that is constituted by God. And God's call for them to be a community in dependence and a community of peace. If it were not for the Lord being on our side, we would be overwhelmed, they would say, as they made their way to Jerusalem, until as they approached the entrance, they would say, our help is in the name of the Lord who made heaven and earth. John Calvin used that one verse in his Genevan liturgy as what he thought was perhaps the best way to begin worship, with the acknowledgement that God is the creator of heaven and earth, and in God is our help. That's who we are, not people who are defined by the sides that we have to choose up amongst each other, but by people who are defined by a dependence upon God. Sometimes it seems like we just can't get away from this choosing sides business. If only we could keep it straight, really, which side we're on. Here we are in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus has told the disciples what lies ahead for him in Jerusalem. They had great disagreement and arguments about that. Jesus had taken three disciples up with him on the Mount of Transfiguration, had seen this glorious vision, but they come down from this glorious vision, and again the disciples engage in argument and fighting and division, even to the point of coming forward with a man whose son they couldn't heal, and they say, "We can't do anything about this. What's going on?" And Jesus seems to get more and more frustrated with them. In the midst of all the glory that he's revealing to them, they can't pull themselves up out of their own fighting, their own bickering, their own divisiveness. It's almost like Jesus is going to get to the point where he's just going to pull out his hair, because every time he speaks to them, they seem to come up with exactly the opposite idea. Jesus again tells them about his journey to Jerusalem and to the cross, and what that will mean for him and what that will mean for them. And then he asked them, do you remember? He asked them, right after he had talked about that, he asked them, what were you all talking about as we made our way along the road? And they said, well, we're talking about which one of us is going to be the greatest in the kingdom when we get there. We're talking about whether he's going to get to sit on your right side or whether he's going to get to sit on your left side. And you think it's going to just cause Jesus to come undone. You think it's just going to cause Jesus to turn his back on these people and walk away from the ones he had called to be his disciples, called to follow him, because they can't seem to follow without getting in a fight about it. And then they go to a house in Capernaum, remember that? And there in the house, Jesus takes a child and he sits it in the middle of them. Perhaps he's holding the child even on his lap, and as he's talking to the disciples, looking at the child, and he says to those gathered there, if you can't be like a child, if you can't trust this way, if you can't live this way, then there's not much hope for you. But this is the way that's my way. Remember that? What an object lesson, like Helen sitting with the children here in the front sharing water, Jesus sitting and talking to his disciples with a child right in the middle of them. And the next thing John does is says, Jesus, you know, we saw somebody trying to heal somebody. We saw somebody trying to cast out a demon in your name. And Jesus, this is what we did. We tried to stop them. And the reason we tried to stop them, it wasn't because they were actually doing something good to help the person. But the reason we tried to stop them is because they weren't following us. They were trying to cast out a demon in your name, Jesus, but they weren't following us, so we tried to stop them. This is John saying that right as Jesus is still sitting there, perhaps with the child on his lap, and having talked to him about the nature of discipleship. And children, I can just imagine Jesus barely able to get his next words out. You saw someone helping another person in my name, and you tried to stop him because he wasn't following us? He wasn't following... John, could you run that past me again one more time? He wasn't following who? Who did you say, John? He wasn't following us, helping somebody in my name, but you stopped him because he wasn't following us? John, don't stop people who are trying to do good in my name. If someone is doing good in my name, they are halfway there to really understanding who I am, John. I don't know, John, who you think you are following. I don't know, John, who you think is following you. But among those who follow me, whoever, John, is not against us is for us. John, does that meet your approval? I know it's a difficult category for you to begin to think about, John, but just try and think about it. The category here, John, is not about who's following us. I want you to begin to try and think of a bigger category, John. The category now, John, is who's not against us. Because, John, if they're not against us, they're for us. John, can you begin to think that way? John, anyone who helps you, John, anyone who gives you a cup of cold water, just because you bear the name of Christ, it doesn't really matter, John, who they are. Doesn't matter at all, John. Whoever gives you, John, whoever gives you a cup of cold water in my name, it won't be before long that they'll receive their reward. Think about that, John. Whoever. Big category. Whatever you do, John, whatever any of you do, Peter, James, Andrew, Matthew, all of you, whatever you do, simply try and do this. Don't be a problem. Don't be an obstacle to someone else who believes. Maybe there is a little one, maybe like this child I'm holding, maybe not like this child, but maybe not even a child, but maybe there's a little one, someone struggling with who they are and what they've done, and maybe they don't understand, and maybe they're confused about something in life. Maybe they've been hurt by certain people. Maybe they've even been hurt by religious people, by folks who seem to be so certain about everything. Maybe they're simply afraid. Maybe they are like the father of that boy who was so sick. You remember John, the father who said, I believe, help my unbelief. But whatever you do, John, Peter, James, Andrew, for goodness sakes, don't be a problem. Don't stand in the way of their belief and trust in me. Don't cause them to stumble. It's a terrible thing to be a stumbling block, Jesus said. It's terrible to be the cause of another person's downfall, especially to be the cause of another person's not being able to know God's love for them in Jesus Christ. Jesus says that's a terrible thing. It would be better, John, if you weren't a part of this kind of fighting, if you weren't a part of this kind of arguing, and if you weren't a part of this kind of way of thinking about us and them that just constantly pulls things apart. It would be better for you, John, if that's the way you're going to be. It would be better if a giant rock were tied around your neck and you were thrown into the sea than to be like that, to only be able to think about us and them. I don't know, maybe Jesus didn't put that much emphasis on the pronouns. What do you think? Who were you worried about them following, John? You tried to stop him because they weren't following us? Whoever. It's much bigger, John, than you can imagine, all right? Whoever. Be very careful. Be very careful that you don't start to be a problem for whoever. Just try and be at peace with one another. What would it mean for us to be able to hear Jesus every day, especially today? What would it mean to be able to hear Jesus say that every day, especially today? Just try and be at peace with one another. There was a fascinating program on Krista Tippett's radio program called On Being earlier this spring. It was a program about two young men who were students at New College over in Sarasota, Florida, college where Cindy Schmidt's daughter Alex attended. Two men, Derek Black, Matthew Stevenson. Matthew Stevenson is an Orthodox Jew, and one of the things he liked to do over at New College was to have a Shabbat, a Sabbath dinner every Friday, and invite his friends in the dormitory to come over to dinner, to come over to Sabbath dinner. Celebrate with them, Jews, non-Jews, Christians, whomever. He was just inviting everybody to come over and have dinner with them. There was another young man, his name was Derek Black. Derek Black grew up in a prominent family of white nationalists. Actually was the godson of David Duke. Actually, Derek was credited himself with developing the child's page on the website of this white nationalist group for children to see so that they could understand what that was all about and maybe be a part of it. That was his background. That was his life. That was his family. Those were his folks. That was his us. And the two of these young men together at New College there. Before long, Matthew said, I think I'm going to invite David to come to Shabbat dinner on Friday night. And his friends sort of looked at him like, are you crazy? He said, no, I think we should invite David to come to dinner, to Sabbath dinner on Friday night. So he did, and it wasn't long after that, very soon after that, that it got out on the internet actually who Derek Black was. And the whole campus started to rise up against him, except for Matthew Stevenson, who said, no, I'm going to just invite him to come to Sabbath dinner. And he did. And so he started to come week after week, Friday after Friday, and to hear them talk about the dinners that they shared there, the conversation that they had. The process of being engaged is to hear how real transformation takes shape, is to hear how it might just be possible for us to begin to actually be at peace with one another. One of the things they say is that they were very intentional, very careful not to talk about things that were going to cause arguments at dinner. Matthew had to say to everybody else that was a part of it, look, we're not going to attack him. We're not going to jump on him. We're not going to beat him up. We're not going to accuse him. We're just going to have him over to dinner, and we'll talk about stuff we're all interested in. What they ended up talking about most of the time was religion, because they were both taking religious courses, and they were both just interested in talking about religion. Week after week after week, across 2 years, they met for these dinners until they began to change. And one of the things that Matthew says changed for him was he began to see with some clarity his background and the things that were so important to him, the things that he were convinced were just absolutely true, 100% right. His whole ideology about who people were, about who the Jews were, about who people of color were, and how we really had to stand in the opposition to him. He began to see all that with some clarity, he said, because in the group was a young woman who was also befriending him and talking to them. But as they kind of talked together, and as they left Shabbat dinner sometimes and went out to sit on the seawall and look out over the water there, they began to talk. And then the young woman said, Derek, I'm so interested in how you can think this way, and how you can be so convinced, and how you can be so sure about that. But here we are talking, and we're friends, and we've been eating the dinner together, but this way that you're thinking, it just seems to me that it's causing great harm, great hurt, great danger, great damage to me and to others who are important to me. And it began to become a crisis for Matthew. And he said he couldn't understand really how he could be divided that way within himself, to be so certain about one thing, but all of a sudden be finding himself in the midst of people who had become his friends and who just enjoyed life together. How could he possibly keep those two ways of life together until he simply couldn't? And what he says was there came a crisis point. There came a crisis point for him, and the others say that they recognized it. They hear them talk about it. They all sort of recognize it and can put their finger on it. He said there came a point where he found that he could no longer live being in the center of us, but he found himself living now in the center of others. His life was no longer rooted and grounded in the center of us, but it was now beginning to grow and be nurtured in the center of others. He said it began to change him and transform him, just as it transformed Matthew and his friends to have Derek there in their midst, to be willing to risk being open and hospitable. They all said, now we know there are lines that when they're crossed, we have to say no to. We know that if you go over a line and say simply and forthrightly and without any kind of reservation about another person, they're evil. If you get to the point where you're simply fully denying the other person's humanity, you can no longer see them as a human being, then you've crossed over. I don't know, maybe you're in that place where Jesus says it would be better if you just had a millstone on your neck and thrown out into the water. But they found their way back to that place where they weren't living at the center of us, but living at the center of others. And now my question is, how do you get there? How are we going to get there? Is there a way for us? Jesus says, I think it starts with a cup of cold water. From whom are you willing to receive a cup of cold water? Can you imagine that, getting a cup of cold water from that person on the other side? Can you do that? To whom are you willing to hand a cup of cold water? Nothing else. No arguments involved, no proving you're right, but just handing a cup of cold water to them. Are you willing to do that? Whoever, Jesus says, whoever can do that, pretty soon, they'll know the reward. Be at peace with one another. Our help is in the name of the Lord.